and share your screen with me now, Patricia.
I'm getting there.
You do it. Okie dokie. Okay. Patricia, I'm going to give you the old fingers, guns when you're ready to go, okay?
Okay.
Okay, let's see. Oh, ding, and the timing is going, okay? One recording going. Get the YouTube going. You're up.
Okay. The Second Coming by Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out when a vast image out of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it, real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So after that perky opening, I'm going to bring it down a little bit. Yeats wrote this poem starting in January in 1919. Interestingly enough, this was also when the second wave of the Spanish flu was hitting. We've heard a lot about that lately. The Russian Revolution was going on. Like I said, World War I. What's interesting is that World War I started shortly prior to a last Pluto-Saturn synod, and it happened in Cancer at 0 degrees. And we know that 0 degrees of any sign, and specifically cardinal signs, always have a wide-ranging global significance. So to have a Pluto synod, a Pluto-Saturn synod on a 0 degree point is quite important. Also keeping in mind that that synod was happening in Cancer, which is opposite the Pluto-Saturn synod that we're having now. So gyres, I want to talk a little bit about this poem because it's relevant for our time. But, you know, this poem gets wheeled out during every time that's perilous for humanity. But the gravity of our moment and the gravity of our situation really calls for a looking into some dark corners, because the dark corners are definitely being exposed. So gyres to Yeats are like the Mayan count of time, cycles within cycles. Yeats had developed a really complex system with these gyres based on or he used them to describe processes of evolution and de-evolution, and they came from his own interpretation of the lunar cycles. And he also expanded that to understand the cycle of incarnation and reincarnation. So in part, when he talked about gyres, and he had a specific interest in Western or history in general, he talked about the religious impulse running in 2,000-year cycles, which is interestingly roughly an astrological age, which is 21,060 years, 2,160 years, sorry. So as one gyre is opening, another one is at a still point, waiting to be born. So we can see that here in this graphic, that as this gyre is reaching a maximum point of expansion, this one is still within itself. As one is widening, the other one, the condensed one, is waiting, waiting to be realized. This is the falcon and the falconer. The falcon is the outer edge of this gyre, has gone so far where chaos and confusion are at its wildest, at its widest at this point. It's furthest from the source of its creation. Thus, it's separated from the original intention, while simultaneously there's this pinpoint, like an eye of the needle, which is the future direction or new impulse that's starting a new cycle. So we know that we are always within widening cycles, gyres, cycles of history, planetary movements, this also indicates, these gyres also indicate that we revisit issues over and over again, and that growth and evolution is not a linear path, it's a circular path, it's a spiral path. Gyres, he also called these as, or named them as, the interlocking energies of discord and concord, and that they're always present together, which is very similar to what Freud talked about when he talked about the dual impulses of Eros and Thanatos, life and the death urge. It's also what we understand as Shiva, as simultaneously within one deity, creator and destroyer. So the falcon here in this widened gyre can be looked at as the ego, the individuated consciousness that's spiraling farther and farther in evolutionary terms from its source. Yeats also perceived a dying god, or a death of a god. He was a student of Nietzsche, by the way. And he saw this decaying, discordant part of this process of a kind of, if we think of this as the ego, it's like the ego is set free from the home, like the child leaving home, to become its own, to individuate, to find itself, to make its own life. Yet separation from the source simultaneously, it can cause a sense of alienation and estrangement when you're separated from your center, or what you've known as security. Part of the loss of vital center, purpose, and meaning can cause us to this desire to retrace back into the past, rather than to pass through this pinhole of the next gyre. This is similar to a stage that we're in now. Capricorn energy, like Cancer energy, most specifically, the cardinal archetypes experience growth as one step forward and one step back. So Capricorn is looking for us here to mature. Being cast out into chaos and confusion isn't meant for us to look back, to retreat into the past just because we feel that the future is scary. Moving to the second part of the poem, Yeats describes the vision, in his vision, the consequences of this. But more to the point, Yeats was commenting on the death of the Christian God. This is what he means by 20 centuries of stony sleep that's vexed to nightmare. What he's talking about is the shadow of Judeo-Christian morality, that as they oppressed the pagan beliefs and all that came with that, which is pleasure of the body and interconnectedness with the environment, all of that which was indigenous prior to the Judeo-Christian beliefs, that they were suppressed by Christianity and held under wraps. And as we know, repressing the shadow doesn't work for a long time because it's going to distort and show itself. But also what he was saying was that there's this decaying religious system that had an imposed moral structure. And when that's removed, because the system itself is decaying, there comes a release of the realm of the underworld. Pluto in Capricorn released this kraken from the depths of the ocean, and it's not going back there soon. I started to notice it most in, you can guess what year, 2012. And in 2012, Pluto and Saturn were in mutual reception, Saturn in Scorpio and Pluto in Capricorn. Back then, I was talking about the importance of integrating shadow. So it appears to me that this rough beast hour has come at last. Spiritus mundi is also a term used by Yeats to describe the collective soul of the universe, which contains the memories of all time. When he talks about this arising out of the spiritus mundi and hearkening back to this imagery of Egypt, of the Sphinx, you know, it makes, well, there's a lot of commentary on this, but it makes one ponder, was he looking back to the godlike power that the pharaohs had? That this next point of evolution, this thing arising out of the spiritus mundi, may be hearkening back to a reclaiming or a revelation of our own divinity. So we've grown so wild away from this moral compass. The shadow, it's been unleashed. It's been chaos. It's tearing apart structures. It's tearing us apart. But these ancient structures like the Sphinx and mythological figures, they exist. They exist in the spiritus mundi as new archetypes waiting to be born. So it's not only the outer forms and structures that are undergoing renovation now, and this is an important point to understand. We are at the turning of an age. The archetypes themselves are evolving. There's something about the subconscious collective, which is where the archetypes reside, that's going under a serious renovation. We are somewhere in this transition, this process of transition between the Piscean age and the Aquarian age. And along with that transition, the archetypes are going to mutate. They're going to transform along with that transition. The sacrificial dying god of Christianity is going to be replaced with some Aquarian version. It's not yet formed yet. I mean, perhaps in New Age circles, we see some intimations of it. There's sayings, you know, in New Age metaphysics, thought creates reality. That's a very Aquarian ideology. Also, we are the ones we've been waiting for. So what is being born here? What is this rough beast? I mean, you know, people have alluded it to the Antichrist. As I said, Yeats was aware, he was deep into metaphysics. He was aware of shadow arising as part of the growth process, and especially the collective growth process. He wrote in another work of his called The Vision about specifically what he saw happening. And he talked about a cycle of history starting in 1927, which he referred to as the 11th Gyre. And I'm going to read this. He said that what must arise is a form of philosophy which will become religious and ethical and will be all things opposite of what's known. It will be concrete in expression, establish itself by immediate experience, seek no general agreement, make little of God or exterior unity. And it will call that good which a man can contemplate himself in doing. In other words, what he's saying is we're going to have our own moral compass, not an external code. This is a sign of spiritual maturity. He goes on to say, it will make a cardinal truth of man's immortality and of the soul's re-embodiment. Men will no longer, this is the most important line, men will no longer separate the idea of God from that of human genius, human productivity in all of its forms. To me, that sounds pretty Aquarian. It sounds pretty Promethean. But until we get there, here we are. Another piece of literature that I've said from the beginning when Pluto went into Capricorn, I called this time the winter of our discontent. Um, So one thing to keep in mind in looking at any transits, because we can get caught up in a lot of, and right now we've been in a flood of them, a flurry of epic making transits, not just, little fleeting things happening. But one thing to keep in mind, and especially from the evolutionary astrology perspective, is that every transit happens with the backdrop of Pluto and whatever sign that it's in and whatever aspects that it's making. And this goes for the individual chart as well as the collective, looking at the collective. I made an analogy of this in my book of Pluto as the drummer in a band. And if you think about it, when you go to see a band, you might be like, looking at the really hot lead singer or paying attention to the keyboard player or whatever it is, but you're still, tapping your toe, you're still dancing to that beat. Pluto is the constant drum beat that goes on behind. So every transit that happens is colored by this very basic psychology. So clearly since 2008, we've been in a winter time. This is the winter time. Steinbeck's novel is also a really useful, it came to me in 2008 and I went back and looked at it and I was like, wow, this is a Capricorn moral tale. It's exactly what the winter of our discontent is about. In short, it's the story of this Ethan who works in this grocery store, and he used to belong to a really rich and wealthy family, but they turned broke, which is also interesting because typically Pluto in Capricorn in an individual chart, or if it's transiting your 10th house, can represent a fall from grace. Nixon had it. Right? So Nixon is a classic example of this. He had a Pluto in the 10th house of what happens with the misuse of power, and that sometimes the universe will enforce a kind of evolution and there'll be a fall from grace. So Ethan had this family that fell from grace, and he's a man of virtue. He's very, upright, upstanding citizen, but his family's very discontented and his friends are discontented. And they kind of convince him to take a hiatus from his morals. And he rationalizes it. And this is a quote from the book down here. He rationalizes it to himself and saying, well, in business and politics, a man can maul his way through men to get to be king of the mountain. And once he's there, he can be great and kind, but he must get there first. So that's what he tells himself. And he makes this 3-part plan where he's going to rob a bank. He's going to turn in, these are very interesting themes for our time. He's going to turn in an illegal immigrant boss so that he can take over the store. And then he's going to steal a plot of land from the town drunk. So all of those plans don't happen, but he is able to get the store and he is able to get wealthy. And just as he starts to succeed, and his family's now happy and his friends are all praising him, his conscience starts to come up. And his son writes an essay for a contest. And later on it comes out, and he wins, and later on it comes out that the son plagiarized the essay. And all of a sudden, Ethan sees himself in his offspring and what the consequences have been of his actions. And the weight to bear, this is very Capricorn, the guilt, the weight bears on him, and he leaves the house to commit suicide. And when he goes out, before he does, he reaches in his pocket and he finds this little talisman that his daughter gave him. And this is what stops him from committing suicide. And he thinks of her as the only untainted member of the family. And he returns home to give the talisman back to her. And in his words, he says, else another light might go out. So in this story, in this winter of our discontent, in this time, in this Pluto and Capricorn time, these themes of morals and ethics, where the ends justify the means, the normalization of things, that are absurd, but normalized, accepted by the consensus, guilt, self-recrimination, depression, and the cost of repression, i.e. suicide, can be one of those costs. Ancestry and lineage and what one is passing on, legacy, one's mortality. These are all themes. And I'm sure you've seen them in a variety of ways in your individual lives and in the collective. Moral code and integrity are an empowered form of the Capricorn qualities. But there's this mentality that the ends justify the means can be part of the shadow, as is, as I said, normalization and conforming. You know, bending the rules just a little is what people do in the winter time because it's hard to survive. We even condone it in our society. We say, well, you know, we can slip on our ethics because it's a jungle out there and it's survival of the fittest, right? And this is what happens when the value framework of a society, which only cherishes success versus that a job well done, or material power versus spiritual power or true power of the self. So again, we're in the winter time, and in the winter time, conservation is also an energy. Conservatism is also an energy. What's interesting is that, of course, wintertime is a naturally contracting time where energy draws inwards. And it's the antithesis of the philosophy of capitalism, which at its heart is continually promising unlimited growth, which is also interesting in that the polarity point to that is Cancer. And if we think of the word Cancer, it's unlimited growth of cells. So the forces of expansion are naturally subdued during the winter, but our unnatural state of economy is at odds with this. And this is part of this as I have some of the major transits that have gone on, that are going on, and Jupiter joining this. This is the conjunctions of January 12th, 2020. With the new Pluto Saturn synod. Jupiter joining this as it is now in here and coming up to conjunctions is only going to exacerbate the dichotomy of expansion and contraction, of our ideology of constant expansion with the natural cycle of the wintertime that we're in. And if you think about it, if something expands and contracts too much, it's eventually going to crack. So speaking of discontent from Steinbeck, the Pluto-Uranus squares, I mean, as we know, they erupted into social unrest, right? The collective expressed or felt this urge, this dire urge for change, but it has yet to be satiated. This is part of the problem of our time. This restless discontent is wild right now. And it's because the fundamental changes that Pluto in Capricorn seeks, as well as this new synod, which is a transformation of all human-made structures, it hasn't occurred yet. So, and what happens what happens during this breaking down period is that the powers that be, which is also Capricorn, part of the Capricorn archetype, they're doing everything they can to consolidate power and to shore up this kind of dying, defunct system. So as a result of this, what was originally this impulse of the Pluto-Uranus squares back in 2011, starting with the Arab Spring, this discontent that wanted to overthrow things for real progressive change has degenerated because the urge was not satiated yet, and it's become degenerate. And I notice it as, I call it, it's a simplistic action of just simply throwing a hand grenade at any problem. It's like people just want the adrenaline rush of blowing something up. And in a way they feel like, ooh, they're awake then, right? They can get out of this slumber, this sleeping winter time. And they just rally against anything. Like we can see this lately, like wear a mask, don't wear a mask, shut down the economy, don't shut down the economy. The discontent and dissatisfaction, they're strong Aquarian energies. There's a lot of polarized groups forming, and they form in these intensified tight circles of like-minded others. And to me, they're loading their grenades and lobbing them at each other with their own disowned projections. This is really the worst way to deal with the shadow that's been unleashed. The higher expression of Aquarius, as we know, is one of liberation. It's one of individuation that leads to liberation. So one thing to keep in mind, freedom for freedom's sake is not freedom, especially when it tramples on somebody else's. And rebellion, just for rebellion's sake, is not individuation. The real fight is mastering oneself, and that's the challenge in this time. Aquarius as a sign is co-ruled by Uranus and Saturn, and that shows not only the constant tension between the past and the future, but the urge to liberate from that which we've been conditioned by and conformed to. So this liberating urge of individuation is always at odds with that which we've been conditioned by. And in evolutionary astrology, again, if you have Pluto transiting your 10th house, or this Pluto in Capricorn generation being born, or Pluto, Saturn, etc., any combination, you're going to find yourself under an intensified urge of deconditioning, because deconditioning and individuation go hand in hand. Jupiter, again, like I said, is in coming up to these conjunctions, as we know, can also exacerbate, blow up even more the Capricorn energy. It can bring us into, you know, it can have positive effects. It's a benefit, right? It can have some beneficial effects here. It can bring forth some different kinds of beliefs, but it can also bring forth a fanaticism and a manipulation and a control through belief and censorship. We've been seeing a lot of this lately. I gave a lecture on this. It's on my YouTube channel. It's free. I gave a lecture on the transiting nodal axis right now in Sagittarius Gemini, because another thing to keep in mind is that Neptune is currently squaring that, and will for the most of the 18 months that we have these transiting nodes in Gemini, Sag Gemini, Sagittarius South Node. And that's going to bring us, that heightens the importance of Jupiter, but it's also going to bring us a lot of misinformation and a lot more confusion about what to believe, what not to believe. Anyway, I have a webinar that I did for the CIA, not the CIA, but I think you have to be clear these days, the Cosmic Intelligence Agency. It's on my YouTube channel. So we know that in 2008, when Pluto went into Capricorn, it was an almost exact financial crisis. And it caused that contraction, was the precursor to the expression of rage and the expression of all that was repressed, all of the unrest being released. So what is the cause of this discontent? Because I think it's a bigger picture than just socioeconomic. Deeper things are stirring in the collective soul. So to me, this discontent can come from this vague yet pervasive sense of soul sickness. We have to think about that. Collectively, we don't have a barometer to measure soul sickness. We're always looking collectively as, you know, barometers for how good we're doing as far as the economy or whatever other yardsticks that we have. But the current yearning to get back to normal is fraught with this backward-looking ideology. It's pitting our innate conscious, this upswelling within our collective that I think is subconscious for many, but not for all, against this collective normalization that we live in, a normalization of greed and rampant consumerism and corruption and inequality, human to human and human to all life forms, you know what I mean. And it brings up this rage, this existential rage. It causes this internal split between what nourishes our souls and what we have agreed upon as reality, right? It's exacerbating an existential estrangement that the individual psyche is going to feel powerless to reconcile. Yet, what we do know is that standing in the middle of opposites and allowing the internal pressure to build and to birth a third way is the ancient alchemical prescription for releasing the gold into the dross. And Pluto in Capricorn is so prime archetypally to be the energy to do that. This estrangement from ourselves. No, I guess we'll go here. This estrangement from ourselves and nature, this is what I'm calling the Capricorn Renovation Project. It's currently manifesting as a collective psychosis. And I think we have to look at these. I've added in here the planetary nodes. Move something here so I can see that. I've added in here the planetary nodes because we all know that this is an epoch in the making. But when you add the planetary nodes, these are the south nodes, you see this is really epoch making. This is deep shaking that's going on. So the south nodes of Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto are all in here between 20 and 29 degrees Capricorn. So exactly conjunct here, Pluto on its own south node, Saturn on its own south node, and on each other's south nodes, and Jupiter again coming into that mix. You know, we can see that this is this deep restructuring that's being called for is preceded by the time that we're in now, like I said, where things are falling apart and anarchy is loosed into the world. Because when the structures fall, just like in a human psyche, if you don't have a healthy ego at the center or an organizing central principle, chaos ensues, psychosis ensues, fragmentation takes over, the shadow takes over. So, like I said, the organizing principle that would normally be at the center is under reconstruction. And when there's no center, everything is running amok. You get subsumed by the contents of the subconscious. The normal ego boundary is fractured. So this time is a time of coming to terms with the collective reality that we've created. We're meant to be pruning what doesn't work. We're meant to be evolving that which does. And as we know, this is difficult to do individually and damn near impossible to do it collectively. This leaves us, well, with more discontent. But, well, I'll get to that later. There's some hope on the horizon. I did want to put in, like I said, I put in these transiting nodes. I wanted to mention some of the past transits that have happened. We had Pluto on on Uranus's south node, and it was hovering there around 2000 when Y2K happened, which is interesting. Uranus, as we know, the energy of Uranus. But even more so, it was still hovering around this point when September 11th happened. And also at that time, we know, was the Saturn-Pluto opposition. Neptune has its own south node over here at 10 degrees in Aquarius. The last time Neptune was transiting around this area from Aquarius into Pisces, and then from Pisces into Aries, which we'll have soon, it was at 29 degrees Pisces into Aries at the beginning of the Civil War, 1861, 1862. Pluto was in Taurus at the time, and Uranus was in Gemini, 9 degrees Gemini. Neptune's going to be moving from Pisces to Aries in 2025-26, the same year that Uranus is going to move from Taurus into, yes, you guessed it, Gemini. So keep those years on your radar screen, 25-26. Pluto will also be in Aquarius by that time, approaching the south node of Neptune. So the last time Neptune was hovering around here, like I said, in the mid 1800s, when it conjuncted its own south node and was hovering around into Pisces, several interesting things happened. Chloroform was first used as a general anesthetic. That's very Neptune in Pisces. Abraham Lincoln was nominated. Antiseptic was first used in hospitals. The Mormons were leaving Utah with Brigham Young. And another really interesting thing that was happening was a movement in America called the Second Great Awakening. And it was the upsurgence of the evangelical movement. And that was when Neptune was in Aquarius and then moving into Pisces. Evangelical churches at the time were kind of rising against the early Calvinist structures, which were very punishing, and they gave more liberty and importance to individuals. So they had a really broad populist interest. Also, what is really interesting is when Neptune was on its own south node here, spiritualism arose in the US. And this started with these sisters known as the Fox sisters, where they heard these in upstate New York knocking. They were communicating with the spirit world through knockings and rappings. And, you know, during the Civil War, when so many families were left without their men, their loved ones returning, they wanted to communicate with them. So spiritualism really took off. And by the end of the war, it's reported that there were 11 million people subscribed to spiritualism, and 35,000 of them were practicing mediums. What's also interesting, because the South Node's in Aquarius, is that it was called the scientific religion because supposedly it offered proof of the afterlife. Well, now when we had Neptune cross over this point again, when it was in Aquarius, guess what came back? Mediumship. The pioneer of this in the public and media was John Edward in crossing over, and then everybody else followed him, Long Island medium, psychic investigators, whatever. But he was the one that really started it. And then also, you know, social media exploded. Part of the difficulty of this transit, I believe at this time, was that technology's become our God. Not something we need to think about. Let me just stop and see if there's any questions.
Not as yet.
Okay, great. So this, the goatfish, as it's called, is a symbol for Capricorn, which to me embodies a lot. Well, you can't really look at one archetype without looking at its polarity, and especially in evolutionary astrology, where we always look to the polarity point of Pluto as a point of evolution. So the two signs are definitely intertwined. And to me, this image of Capricorn as the goatfish brings in the watery element of Cancer. So I just want to talk about this briefly when we talk about the wheel of the zodiac here. A primary division of the zodiac wheel are the signs below the horizon and the signs above the horizon. As we can see, the cardinal axis intersects this wheel and brings it different quadrants of meaning. So this lower subjective development of self, I guess I just want to say we're talking archetypally, so don't think if you have, you know, all your planets down here that you're just, you know, subjectively unevolved. That's not the point. This is a kind of, you know, archetypal look at the wheel of the zodiac itself. So this subjective development of the self, when it breaks above the horizon, breaks into interpersonal relationships, which then, or it's the growth of the self through contact with the other, as we know in Libra, that then progressively gets more and more expanded. The self becomes expanded through its social contact, through its merging with others, and then through its sense of meaning, and it becomes progressively transpersonal. So symbolically, when Pluto crossed here, we could say that symbolically Pluto crossed from this transitional mutable archetype of Sagittarius across the MC. It now emphasizes or brings its power to bear on the last quadrant of the zodiac, which is Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. As we know, Saturn is ruler of Capricorn, represents the rings of Saturn have been said to represent the boundary of what's known, the limits of the ego self that then breaks into the transpersonal realm and the transpersonal planets. Capricorn is that gateway to the Capricorn itself being one of the transpersonal signs, but also a gateway to the other transpersonal, or the most transpersonal of transpersonal signs would be this last quadrant. So Pluto breaking there, and Pluto representing the force of evolution upon the soul, the force of one's individual soul and collective soul. Pluto breaking into this quadrant is showing that this little, what I call the little s self, right? The development of the little s self that has expanded itself into progressive socialization and now breaking into the transpersonal is at a dire place of needing to expand itself to embrace the greater S self, the big S self, the transpersonal self. Cancer at the IC here symbolizes, as we know, this kind of birth into the outer world where the nascent awareness of others is born. It's here and you're kind of forced into it because you're not in the amniotic fluid anymore, and all of a sudden, bang, you're pushed out there into the world of others. And you know, as an infant, mother is our everything. And it's here where we receive our deepest imprinting. As I was saying, conditioning is part of the Capricorn archetype. Imprinting is part of the Cancer archetype. The formation of our ego happens here. It starts in the womb. We are actually being deeply imprinted in the womb by not just collective content, but by the experience of mother all around us and her emotional state. And in fact, in our early infant development in utero and after birth, the imprinting and mirroring that happens from mother is what shapes our ego. It is what shapes the part of us that will, our ego is our container that carries us into the outer world. So we have, but the ego is like a shell, right? Like the crab shell that protects the soft flesh of the crab. The crab does molt though and outgrow it. And the crab has to kind of back out of the shell with its new shell. And this is a process that we always go through, what I mean by the expansion of the little s self into the big S self. But when we emerge here, and we have this ego that then becomes stronger and stronger as we grow, in our early stages, it's very vulnerable. And our most vulnerable subjective selves are here, you know, contained here at the IC of the chart. It's like this very vulnerable part is brought to subjected to the outer world, this heartache and thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to, as Hamlet said. And so this is how, when we have our formed ego, how it hardens, right? It's some of those shocks, it's some of those slings and arrows. In our early development in our ego cells, we take in mother's reality as if, like her milk, we take it in wholesale. And through the course of our life, we are meant to, as I said, individuation and deconditioning are part of these. We are meant to make the inner world and the outer world congruent. This is part of what I see in the goat here. No matter where you go, your past goes with you. You're always dragging your fishtail. You climb up the mountain, but you're dragging that fishtail behind you. And this is part of what happens in the cardinal signs, what I mean about 1 step forward and 2 steps back. You can't truly progress unless you can't truly decondition and individuate unless you go back to that deep subconscious imprinting. So Capricorn here, and now, like I said, all of this happening up here, the Capricorn is the apex of the cardinal archetypes. It's also in its empowered form known as the sign of the initiate. It's the mastery of form. And when we think of, you know, diamonds formed under intense geothermal pressure, what's being called forward here is that you birth some deep jewel hidden within the recesses of your psyche, but it happens through psychological tension. In Capricorn, we are at the apex of cardinal tension. All of the accomplishments in the outer worlds, they're directly intertwined with the amount of transformation that we can make through our inner world, through the application of self-mastery. The father archetype reigns here, right? Archetypally, it's father who shows us the rules of society, the traditions, how to emerge into the world. He models for us the outer world. Again, I'm talking archetypally. And because we participate in the underworld, we are then subject to its conditioning. Like I said, it's the sign of the initiate, the wizard. The esoteric meaning of Capricorn on the spiritual path is where one turns their back on all worldly accomplishments and sets their sight on a higher mountain, right? It's following a supernal light. You've come to realize at this point on a spiritual path, if you're on a spiritual path, that there's more than this, right? And that now you're called to apply all of the maturity, responsibility, and accomplishment that you gained in the material world and apply it to that discipline that's required for spiritual development. So that is I'm not saying that collectively we're doing that, but certainly each of us are each of us individuals are experiencing this transit and may very well, you know, be feeling some of these increased impulses. When Pluto went into Capricorn in 2008, I gave a series of lectures on the hero's journey and pointed out that this Capricorn archetype is very aligned with these stages in the hero's journey that are called the tests and the trials and the great ordeal, and most importantly, atonement with the Father. And interesting at this stage is when, if we go to the original Star Wars, I use Star Wars as a modern myth, the original Star Wars, this stage, this Capricorn stage, part of this stage is when Luke Skywalker finds out that Darth Vader is his father. And he's in horror and he's hanging. Remember, he had his arm cut up and he's hanging. And rather than even comprehend it, or even be swayed by the conditioning that would come with being Darth Vader's son, he lets go and falls down this huge canal. What's also interesting is an illustration of the union of the interplay between Cancer and Capricorn here, again, the tail and the goat, is that it was Anakin, and we learned from the prequel in Star Wars that it was Anakin Skywalker's father, Anakin Skywalker, who couldn't save his mother, became his primal kind of Cancerian wound, the mother wound. He couldn't heal that, and that was his Achilles heel that caused him to become Darth Vader. And Luke Skywalker had the father wound, right? He was fatherless. So he was then left to kind of parent himself and become a Jedi through self-mastery. So again, the inner world is intimately tied into the outer world. And the progress that you make on the inner world is directly reflected in the outer world. And as I want to say again, true mastery it is mastery over form, but it depends on which form we're talking about. True mastery comes by making the inner and the outer congruent. As I said before, the lower half of the wheel, and also just to point this out, we always have Pluto Saturn synods every 37 years or so. The Cancer one I talked about was in 1914. Again, below the horizon. The next one was in 1947 in Leo, again below the horizon. But the Libra one, which happened in 1982, Pluto-Saturn synod kind of broke us collectively above the horizon. There's a lot to be said about this synod that we recently experienced or have just concluded. And then we have Capricorn. So there's a lot of gravity about these cardinal points above the horizon having been emphasized by these Pluto-Saturn synods. I mean, right here, collectively, we are deconditioning. The systems are failing us. We are outgrowing the Father. And when that happens, individually or collectively, it's going to trigger emotional insecurity. Those things that you were once rooted in for emotional security are being ripped up. Yes, this process leaves fresh soil for new seeds, but it also disturbs the very ground of our being. When this happens collectively, individually, we are known to regress. It's shown in psychological work that when one is triggered, when we're under stress or we're triggered, we revert to an earlier unconscious regressive state. In this way, memory is associative and not linear. So our consciousness, if we're triggered in the moment with something, will regress to usually a more childlike state when we were less when we were less able to deal with it, why it's become suppressed, when we were more in our Cancerian selves. I mean, I do past life work too. I've been doing it for 20 years. It's one of my, something I have mastered, wrote book about. When we get triggered, the earlier content arises, the affect of the earlier content, the emotional content arises and rushes to the surface, whatever's been unhealed or repressed, and it can overcome the consciousness. We get overcome by regressive emotions that just seem out of place in the present day, yet we feel them as equally charged as they were when they were originally imprinted. Important to know this because collectively there has been a regression going on. Collectively, we've been looking for authoritarian figures. We've been looking for Capricorn fathers. We've been looking for those types, and I say we loosely, but the collective has been looking for these leaders, authoritarian leaders that can make things black and white for us, simplify it, make it good and bad, because this information climate that we live in, or the information ecology as it's called, is very nuanced. It's very complex for a person to navigate. So somebody who's triggered by the shaking of their security structures, collectively, again, we're looking for those fathers. This in the US, we can see it. The longing to return to when America was great is like some black and white or sepia-toned photo, right, of America post-war, post-depression. Again, back to that Pluto synod in Cancer. That time was called the golden age of capitalism, right? It's when capitalism took root. I mean, interestingly, back then, TV was black and white. And the enemy, it was easy to know who your enemies were. There were world wars. It's black and white. There were racial divides. It's black and white. Fortunately, civil rights was signed into act right after the Pluto-Leo synod, Pluto-Saturn synod in Leo. What I feel we're really longing for, though, is authority, not authoritarianism. We're longing for personal sovereignty. As someone pointed out during the coronavirus thing, corona means crown, and that there could be some crowning that comes out of this. Crowning is also when the baby breaches, right? Something we know is being born. We don't know yet if collectively we can rise to the challenge, but we do know individually we can. Because individually, this is a time where we are meant to reconcile shadow parts that arise, and we are meant to decondition and individuate. Okay, so as I said, just to nutshell this last part, Pluto is calling us to call forth deeper inner resources that push the personal limits, push our personal limits, Saturn. Okay. So when I was putting together this lecture, I came across this writing, which is something that informed me when I was in my teens. It's writing from Seth, who was a channeled entity by Jane Roberts' series of books in the 70s called Seth Speaks, The Nature of Personal Reality, etc. This nailed it. I found this and I said, oh my God, this is what I've been saying. How did I forget about this? So let me read this to you and unpack it a little bit. Seth is saying, ego consciousness must now be familiarized with its roots or it will turn into something else. You are in a position where your private experience of yourself does not correlate with what you were told by your societies, churches, sciences, archaeologies, or other disciplines. So this is important. This is exactly what we're talking about. This is what Yeats was talking about too, right? The ego needs to become something else. It needs to grow, to contain the potentialities of what is arising for us. Are we meant to just be a cog in the machine of the military-industrial complex? Does that nurture us individually, collectively? I mean, are we meant to just be servants to corporate and capitalistic survival? Is that what gives us meaning? What are our real roots? These are questions that come up. I'm putting these out there for you to also consider. Is it pre-patriarchal memory? Is it that archaic memory? I mean, personally, I feel the roots that we're meant to remember are the roots of our memory of our connection and interconnectedness, not only with each other, but nature, because we've removed ourselves from cooperation to control over. It seems imperative that if our consciousness does not remember, bring together, remember that which we have dissociated from, that it's going to become increasingly deformed. And Seth also alludes to that in this passage too. Where he says, where did I leave off? Man's unconscious knowing is becoming more and more consciously apparent. This will be done under and with the direction of an enlightened and expanding egotistical awareness that can organize the hereunto neglected knowledge, or it will be done at the expense of the reasoning intellect, leading to a rebirth of superstition, chaos, and the unnecessary war between reason and intuitive knowledge. Well, we have been at war. I mean, reason and intuition have been at war for a long time. The age of reason, the age of enlightenment, etc. Getting rid of the ego is a fallacy. It's a fallacy of some spiritual systems. What we're really doing is expanding the ego. This is what Jung talked about when he was talking about the self and the totality of the psyche. It's what I'm talking about when I talk about the little s self and the big S self. The little s self progressively expands. It's not a shattering of the ego or doing away with the ego. It's that the ego can grow enough to contain more and more, like those gyres or like concentric circles, right? That this is the way that we grow. We progressively become more and more of the big S self. Okay, so Seth goes on to say, when at this point now of mankind's development, this emerging unconscious knowledge is denied by his institutions, then it will rise up despite those institutions and annihilate them. Cult after cult will emerge, each unrestrained by the use of reason, because reason will have denied the existence of rampant unconscious knowledge, disorganized and feeling only its own ancient force. So if you've been on Facebook or social media lately, you will see that the real epidemic that's happening is one of psychic chaos. Again, this pitting, this pitting of one against the other, and to mask or not to mask, to vax, to not, they become cults in their own right. The kind of polarized thinking. And each side is kind of grappling with the reason to shore up their position, one YouTube video at a time. If we take the fact that science as a pinnacle of reason, which it does aspire to be, and intuitional knowledge as its opposite, then you can see that there's been in our time a concerted effort, especially with conspiracy theories and our president, to discredit science and replace it with something close to evangelical fervor. This is the climate. It's the climate that informs this kind of adolescent primal tearing down of institutions that we see now. Now, what we see now may, in essence, be the nascent beginnings of what Seth is talking about here. But mature, wise intuition has not yet filled the vacancy. But as we know, the structures have not fully fallen. So we're somewhere in this process. As astrologers, this question of reason and intuitive knowledge that our society has falsely set against each other, as astrologers, we span that false divide just by the nature of what we do. And are we not challenged with the fact that there's no place for us at large in societies, in consensus reality, right? And I've seen it in the astrology world. Sometimes the astrology world tears itself apart, trying to squeeze itself into the narrow definition of science, only to be accepted by the consensus, only to be accepted by these institutions. And then there's the other side, right, in the astrology world, where you have unleashed, the people don't do depth of research and rely only on their subjective intimations. So Seth goes on to say, if this happens, all kinds of old and new religions and denominations will war and all kinds of ideologies surface. This need not take place. For the conscious mind, basically now, having learned to focus in physical terms, is meant to expand, to accept unconscious intuitions and knowledge and organize these deeply creative principles into cultural patterns. So think about that. What does that look like? I mean, wow, what does that look like? I mean, I don't think we're there yet, but I ask you to continue and ponder. How do we collectively maintain our intellect and reason, yet integrate intuitive knowing into our cultural patterns? Okay, let me just stop and see if there's anything that needs to be said or asked.
There's one question in there.
Okay, go ahead. I'm looking at the time.
Just from Christine, saying that's a primary theme of Saturn in Capricorn, learning to find the Father within and finding sovereignty. And isn't this the purpose of the conjunction?
Yes. Yes, but again, the collective process of doing it and the individual process is always different, unfortunately. I always say that collective doesn't manifest ideals very well. We do better at it at individuals, and then even then, we're not all that great. Okay, so I need to talk about psychosis. Unfortunately, I need to talk about Wedico. This book Paul Levy wrote, I urge you to read this because it's written several years ago, but definitely relevant for our time. It's called Dispelling Wedico. And he's talking about this, again, a bit like what Seth was talking about. That which we can't give form to will tear us apart. And Levy gets into that also. But what he's talking about is here in this quote, as a species, we're experiencing an undeniable uprising of the dark destructive forces of the collective unconscious. As thinking, reflective, conscious human beings, we can no longer deny the dark stirrings of the unconscious as it plays itself out ever more conspicuously on the world stage. These overwhelming psychic forces are active powers that cannot be fitted into our rational world order, explained away by reason, nor argued out of existence. We are being confronted with the naked darkness of the soul and asked, no, make that demanded, to come to terms with and face up to this. The dark side of our nature, or we could even say the shadow of God, is revealing itself and incarnating through the unconscious of humanity. Yes.
10 minutes.
Oops. Okay. So Wediko is an Algonquin word, a Native American word for a cannibalistic spirit. And it's a cannibalistic energy that's driven only by greed and excess and selfish consumption. And Levy writes about this in his book, that we are in a time, as the Native Americans viewed the colonizing powers, colonization is also a Capricorn, Saturn archetype, that we are in a time of this, of being overtaken by this cannibalistic energy, which to the point of our own peril. The Native Americans said that when they saw the whites, that they were infected with the virus of selfishness, which is another description of Wediko, and they didn't understand it. They said that that they were so consumed by it. So in the Native American understanding, Wediko can be a virus that infects somebody, and when it takes over somebody enough, a person themselves becomes a Wediko. And we can see this. There's a lot of Wedikos in the world right now, those that are driven only by selfishness and greed and power and lust and all of those things. This is the darkest part, when the human ego, like Yeats said, the falcon can't hear the falconer anymore, right? The little s self is running amok. So what do we do with this? What do we do with this energy? It is all around us. Our culture has been infected by the Wediko virus long before coronavirus, where we need to take over, we need to control, we need to consume. And the best way to deal with this upswelling of the darkness that's coming, the destructive forces of the collective unconscious, is to become conscious of the darkness. The only way to do that is to do shadow work. I have a slide here, which again is not going to have you fully work with your shadow, but it's going to help you on an individual level have some guideposts of what does it mean to start to confront, uncover, and embrace the parts of yourself that may be disowned, because you need to re-own them so that they're not running amok. Because the collective environment will only, because the collective is soaking in it, it'll only bring you down with it, and you don't want that to happen. So here's some guidelines, right? One way to start looking at parts of yourself that are unintegrated, or to ask for feedback from people who love you, really people who love you, to help get you a mirror of yourself that you may not be able to see, because we're always projecting. And then that's the other part of this. We need to examine our projections. We need to become aware of our hypocrisies. Hypocrisy is a classic Capricorn phrase or energy. And it's where we are hypocritical is where our shadow is showing. We need to listen to feedback from other people when they tell us that we're not acting. They tell us we're acting in a different way and we think we're not, right? This is just an honest assessment of oneself, being open to developing, when you're triggered by something, or when you're taken over by something, you go into one of those regressive states, develop a curiosity about it. You know, develop a curiosity about your hypocrisies, your idiosyncrasies, because shadow work involves opening up to shame. There's usually shame around these things. But inside is this alchemical process where the gold is released within the dross. And so you have to go through those difficult feelings. You have to go through the shame and all of the things that caused you to repress this part of yourself, your own tyrant, your own narcissist, your own whatever, any part of yourself that your consciousness has felt unable to integrate. Notice when you act under stress, when something just slips out. This is what Freud called, you know, Freudian slips. They also reveal deeper motives, right? They reveal motives behind the mask that you might be wearing, right? We wear a mask to kind of hold the, you know, nice politenesses. And just like I believe our civilization is a mask, civility is a thin veneer, right? It doesn't take a lot to look underneath that and see where it's rotten.
5 minutes, Patricia.
Okay, almost done here. Also look at when you act different in a crowd, or when you're in a sporting event, or at a concert, or with public, or with certain people that you hang out with. If they bring, this is why we often see at big mass gatherings, maybe like Trump rallies, for example, this dark part that comes out of people that maybe given left to their own devices, they wouldn't be expressing. But that happens to us because this, whatever, a collective upswelling can bring something out of us that would normally surprise us. That's shadow. That's what shadow is. And also pay attention to your daydreams, your dreams, your fantasies. That's where our subconscious kind of lets the release valve, lets some steam out. And pay attention to those, because they can also be gateways to shadow. And I want to leave you with another poem, because we are groping in the dark here. We are in a time that they call nigredo in alchemy. It's the blackening. It's the dark night of the soul. It's when we are meant to, all that is impure is meant to be burnt off by external pressure and fire, so much so that the inner fire is awakened. So it's a dark time. It's a dark time that has a purpose, right? And I found this poem by this very little known woman poet, and I just love it because it is, again, something so potent for our time. Go forward, my soul and soul of today, fatherless, alone, unafraid with the weapons of courage, the lenses of progressive truth in the attempt to find the great common factor upon which all may agree. Search beyond the beautiful configurations of matter, the rocks of ages, the manifold wonders of earth, dear to the five shallow senses, beyond the flaming fields of force, the majestic ocean of radiant energy, the milky spiral on which we wheel, and the meta-galaxies that are gyres upon gyres of splendor, vibrating on the edge of unlighted space. Forward into ever-expanding circles of magnificent realization, fearlessly through whatever vast and lonely black abyss may lay beyond the fellowship of suns, into the fearful sublimity of the absolutely unknown. Go forward, my soul and soul of today, unneedful of personal salvations and immortalities, self-surrendered, magnificently merged with the whole, rejoicing in the glory that seems and helping to kindle the glory that is yet to be. There you go. Go forward.
Thank you, Patricia. Okay, everybody, I'm going to be closing the room now. And if you all want to go and chat, why don't you all go back to your schedule and click on the first opening lecture, which will be the Northwest Ballroom, and you can all go in there and chat away.
Well, didn't you say that we are going to close this room and then we can come back in the room if people have questions and they want to chat?
Oh, I can do that as well, but I'll be closing the room now, and then we'll reopen it within 3 minutes.
Okay, so if anybody wants to come back and have a
Chat.
question or thoughts or whatever, I'll be back in the room.
Patricia, I'll come back and I'll make you host or make you co-host if you wanted to share anything on screen as well. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
All right, bye.